a new book. This book we're about to study is still read in Israel during Pentecost. Did that help? Doubtful, right? This book has 85 verses. It's been called one of the best classic short stories. And hey, guys, one of the best mother-in-law stories. Got your interest piqued, right? Ladies, it's one of the best love stories. But guys, don't worry. Ruth doesn't fit the chick flick motif of our culture. So we don't want to get into that. But let's begin by learning when, where, who, and why of this story, at least part of it. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, the first of 85 verses. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed, that'd be the book of Judges, that there was a famine in the land, that would be of Israel, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. So the judges were governing. When did the judges govern? Well, it's after the Exodus from Egypt, right? After they got back in the land. It was after the conquest of Canaan that was led by Joshua. So it was after Joshua, but before the establishment of the monarchy when King Saul, was anointed. So that's where we fit in the years between Joshua and King Saul. Some commentator has called the judges, the time of the judges, the time of Israel's dark age, a time that ended in corruption in the nation and a bloody civil war. If you've ever studied Judges, you'll recall it fundamentally ends that way. It was a time when Israel repeatedly wandered away from Yahweh. They had a weak faith. They were harassed by their neighbors, and Israel experienced brief periods of repentance, but followed quickly by irresponsible behavior. So it was not a good time in Israel. And it was an early time. They hadn't been in there very long before this began to happen. It's described in a couple of different verses in Judges. 17:6 is one. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. So irresponsible behavior ruled the day. It was a time of disobedience, idolatry, and violence. The book of Ruth, by contrast, is going to show us a few people acting responsibly, lovingly, and in faith. So again, as we saw in verse 1, the story begins with a Hebrew man and a famine. Some believe the famine is the one in Judges 6. Now there is a famine in Judges 6, but it was a man-made famine that was born by the destruction brought to the land by enemies of Israel. So there was a famine, okay, but it wasn't from drought. It was from enemy activity. The man lived in Bethlehem, which means, of course, the house of bread. But even though he lived in the house of bread, he felt it necessary to leave in order to feed his family. At least that's what we would suspect. He packed up his family, moved how far? Well, it's only about 50 miles east and south from Bethlehem to Moab. It was opposite the Dead Sea, on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. Now, Moab was not always friendly to the Hebrews and their nation, and there's a lot of history between the two. Now, let's go back and think about famines again. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the first three fathers of Israel, all experienced famine, and each one moved to escape it. But what happened? Well, they all three went to a foreign land to deal with it. Abraham, and this is in Genesis 12, you can find this. Abraham went to Egypt, but when he did so, he had a problem with Pharaoh because he deceived Pharaoh about Sarah, telling Pharaoh Sarah was his sister, which technically was not a lie, but it was to deceive Pharaoh into believing that Sarah was not married. Abraham got himself in a pickle there. Turns out a little bit later, Isaac, and this is in Genesis 26, Abraham's son did the same thing. But this case, Isaac went to the Philistines to avoid the results of a famine. God had told him, don't go to Egypt like your dad did, but so he went to the Philistines. But he deceived the king of the Philistines, much like Abraham had deceived Pharaoh. It was about his wife, Rachel, who was a beautiful woman. Jacob in Genesis 46 went to Egypt, and you remember that story. It's a story of Joseph, but it resulted in 400-year stay in Egypt, out of Canaan, out of the promised land, and most of that time was under the bondage of slavery. So the first three fathers of Israel did not fare well when it came to famines. Well, let's get back to Ruth. We note that the Hebrew family intended to sojourn, that was the term used, which means they were going to go live temporarily in Moab. They would be foreign aliens. They would not be citizens of Moab. They're just there temporarily, and then they're going to go back. So what are some of the key elements of the history between Israel and Moab? I mentioned there was a lot of history. Well, first thing is that they're cousins, the Israelites and the Moabites. Moabites were descended from Moab, the son of Lot, by his older daughter. You remember this happened after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. You can read it in Genesis 19. Well, who was Lot? Well, Lot was Abraham's nephew. Here I go again. Abraham's nephew. He was the son of Abraham's brother Haran, Haran. Did I say Haran or Haram? It's Haran. Genesis 11 gives you that piece of information. Now, Moab, when Israel came out of Egypt, Moab said, no, I don't want you going through this land. And so they refused to allow Israel to pass peacefully through the land. And they hired Balaam, remember the for-profit prophet, spelled two different ways, of course. The king Balak of Moab hired Balaam to curse the Hebrews. You find that in Numbers 22 through 25. But before entering the promised land, though, the men of Israel had immoral relations with some Moabite women, resulted in a plague, and the men ended up, in many cases, worshiping Baal, or as Moabites would have called it, Chemosh, however you want to pronounce it. You can see that in Numbers 25. But there were other confrontations as well, some battles between the two nations. At least one of them was during the period of Judges. If you want to find out about that, you can check Judges chapter 3. And you will find also in chapter 11 of Judges some of Israel's difficulties with Ammonites. So why bring in Ammonites? Well, Ammonites were cousin of Moabites. Ammon, the progenitor of the nation, was the son of Lot by his younger daughter. Lot got involved a couple of times shortly after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Check Genesis 19 for that also. By the way, as long as you're at this, you might as well recall that there are 3 other cousin sets of Israel. Who gave Israel problems? The first, Ishmaelites, descended, of course, from Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, from whom we find the Arabs, of course. Edomites descended from Esau, Isaac's firstborn son. And the Edomites probably were a bigger thorn in Israel's side than almost anyone else. The book of Obadiah is all about that. Some book maybe we'll do one of these days. And then there were the Midianites who were involved in this. They were descended from Midian, who was another son of Abraham by his second wife, Keturah, after Sarah's death. You'll find that in Genesis 25. So all through Genesis, you find the connections between these groups of what I call cousins. I'm thinking it was Chill Wills who used to use the term cousin in Westerns all the time. Yeah, no consequence, right? Relative to Midian, by the way, Mount Sinai was in the land of Midian. It's on the northwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula, below Moab. That's where Moses fled when he left Egypt, and he spent 40 years there tending sheep after he picked up a wife, and it was her father's sheep that Moses tended. And they were involved in the incident with Balaam and Moab, also in Numbers 22 to 25. And you find that particularly in chapter 25 of Numbers. And they were responsible, interestingly, for the famine back in Judges 6 that many scholars believe was the famine that led to the book of Ruth. A lot of history, and there's going to be more of it to come. But let's get back to our story. Let's go to verse 2 of Ruth. We're going to look at the first 5 verses today. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon, Mahlon, and Chilion, Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. So that's the sojourn we're talking about. There we have the family, a man, wife, and 2 sons. The names, if you're interested, Elimelech means my God is king. Remember that when you see El at the beginning of a name or at the ending of a name, it's generally from Elohim, meaning God. And you have the same thing with J-A or J-A-H, Yah, or Y-A-Y-A-H, Yah, also means the name is associated with God in some way. Naomi means pleasant. Mahlon means sickly. And Chilion means pining. So the boys have odd names. It's going to come into play perhaps a bit. Ephrathites, by the way, were from Ephratah, which was an earlier name for Bethlehem. You can see that in Genesis 35, verse 19, in a sad ending to one story. So Rachel died, that's Jacob's wife, the one he loved most over Leah, and was buried on the way to Ephrat, depending on how you want to say it, that is Bethlehem. So, and the word Ephrath or Ephratah may have been used to distinguish because there were two Bethlehems in Israel. Did you know that? Do you know whose tribal allotment the second Bethlehem was in? Well, it's easily answered. Joshua 19, verses 15 and 16 say this. Included also were Ketah and Nahalal and Shimron and Adalah and Bethlehem, 12 cities with their villages. Now, they're not all named here. They were named in previous verses. This is verse 16, this was the inheritance of the sons of Zebulun, according to their families, these cities with their villages. And Zebulun's region was in the northern kingdom part, so up near the Galilee. But back to Ruth now again. Things got worse for this family before they got better. Look at verse 3 of Ruth, chapter 1. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. Well, a widow was at the mercy of her family for support, but she's in Moab. So who was her family? Well, in this case, it would have been her two sons that would have been responsible for providing for Naomi. But the boys had their own sets of needs and plans. Look at verse 4. And they, that's Naomi's sons, took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, O-R-P-A-H, and the name of the other was Ruth. How about that? And they lived there about 10 years. So the sojourn turned into at least a 10-year stay. Here's a cultural side note, something that some of you may have heard before. And I don't know that it's got anything to do with the story, except it's a modern cultural note. If you interchange the R and the P from Orpah, what does that give you? Oprah, O-P-R-A-H. So from O-R-P-A-H, Orpah, you get O-P-R-A-H, Oprah. And I probably don't need to tell you who Oprah is today. Well, the sojourn, as I said, turned out to be about 10 years. And by the way, Mahlon and Chilion got married. It turns out, we'll find this out later, Mahlon married Ruth, and Chilion married Orpah. Now, kind of interesting again, Ruth's name means friendship. Orpah's name means stubborn. So there you have our major players, except for two. There are two further players that we will see who are not given to us yet. The first is God, who is at work behind the scenes, orchestrating all of the events. The hero will be introduced later. Now, nothing is said about their life in Moab, but one suspects that the two sons provided for all three women. That would have been their nuclear family, if you want to call that, but it's extended, I guess, since there are two sons, two wives, one mother-in-law. So Naomi is a mother-in-law that we referred to earlier. Some will tell us that Hebrew men weren't supposed to marry Moabite women. Well, the restriction was actually for Canaanite nations, women in Canaanite nations, when those nations were driven out by Israel. The men, and I don't have the reference ready at hand, somewhere in the first 5 books of Moses, you'll find the prohibition against marrying Canaanite women. But there appears to be no injunction against marrying women from Moab, at least at this time. There may be some resistance to it later, in David's time, for example. But however, marriages to foreign women generally were opposed after the Babylonian captivity, which is even a long time after David. Ezra and Nehemiah came back, and at that time, then, one of the issues they dealt with was the intermarriage with foreign women. So, specifically, were men told they can't marry Moabites? Apparently not. Keep in mind, though, that the Moabites were idolaters worshiping Chemosh, which is essentially the same as worshiping Baal. So you've got a bad situation when men are marrying women who are or could well be idolaters, especially to Baal. Well, there's another, and we'll look at verse 5, our last verse for today. There's another negative turn of events. Look at Ruth 1:5. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. The husband, the father died. The 2 sons have both died, and the women was bereft, and the woman, that's Naomi, was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. So there we are. We now have 3 women, 1 older, 2 younger, with no male support. So where was Naomi to find compassion for her plight? Where could she find support? And what about Orpah and Ruth? Where would they find support now? Naomi's not going to find support in Moab because she is not a Moabite. So her family's not there. Well, it is family to which Naomi has to turn. That's the only place a widow could receive support. That was from family. And that's going to be a major issue in the next scenes coming up in the book of Ruth. Orpah and Ruth would each have had a family in Moab, a family in which they were born. Nothing is said about whether they are related or not, so it could have been 2 separate families. But also, Orpah and Ruth could have had support from their husbands' families. So as long as they're in Moab, Orpah and Ruth may have found support, but Naomi couldn't. So what are we going to see in the rest of this book? Well, sovereign acts of God are going to be showing us his providential care. And there are going to be several people, as we mentioned earlier, acting righteously. We're going to get a positive comparison of some people in Israel who were not acting like most of Israel during this time of Judges. Couple of takeaways. First, Elimelech made a mistake in going to Moab. He was acting outside the character of his name. Remember, God is my king. So he abandoned his king and took off because of the famine. And the notion is that alternatives to relying on God can have negative consequences. Furthermore, God's plan for each individual may seem purposeless before the end. What about Naomi? What about Ruth? What about Orpah? What's God's plan for them? We see nothing so far that would indicate where each of these 3 women fit into any plan of God. But interestingly, if God had told Ruth what was in store for her and what her role in Israel would be, she would have been blown away. We talked about one time, and those that have been with us for a while, Habakkuk was blown away when he said, God, you're not doing anything. God said, oh, yes, I am. And let me tell you what is going to take place. But when I tell you, you're going to have a hard time accepting it and believing it. Well, next session, we'll see Naomi's decision, what she's going to do. That's rather clear. Even if you don't know the story of Ruth, you'd have a fair idea of what Naomi's decision has to be. But she's going to give advice to both Orpah and Ruth, and you can probably guess what that advice would be. It's natural advice that you would expect from a woman of her nature and her caliber. So Naomi's advice, incidentally, we might as well look at it now before we tune out here. There's another Old Testament scripture which will tell you maybe why Naomi might have said what she said. It's in Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 and 4. Now listen to this. No Ammonite, that's a cousin of the Moabites, or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord, meaning the tabernacle at that time. There was no temple yet. None of their descendants, the Ammonites or the Moabites, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. So God said, if you're a Moabite or Moabitess, you ain't going into the tent of assembly, into the tabernacle. So if either Orpah or Ruth were to go with Naomi, who is obviously going to have to go back to Israel, they could not worship in Israel inside the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle. That's what Deuteronomy was saying. Stay tuned. Could be interesting. There's a lot more to the book of Ruth than you may read.